A man risks everything to save a helpless pit bull puppy trapped in a raging river. But when the mother appears, everyone expects the worst. What happens next will leave you speechless. Before we dive into this emotional and powerful story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories like this one. The sun was setting over a quiet town nestled along a winding river. Mark, an avid hiker in his early 40s, was enjoying the solitude of the trails when he heard it, a faint, desperate sound carried by the breeze. He stopped, his ears straining to identify the source. It was a whimper, high-pitched and terrified. Curiosity turned to concern as Mark made his way toward the riverbank. The sight that greeted him sent a jolt of adrenaline through his body. There, clinging to a slippery rock in the middle of the rushing current, was a small pit bull puppy. Its tiny paws clawed at the surface, its cries growing weaker with each passing second. Without hesitation, Mark dropped his backpack and surveyed the scene. The water was icy, and the current looked strong enough to sweep away a grown man. But the fear in the puppy's eyes struck a chord deep within him. He couldn't leave it there. Mark waded into the water, the cold biting at his skin as he fought against the current. The puppy's cries grew louder as he approached, a mix of fear and hope in its tiny frame. With one final push, Mark reached the rock, scooping the trembling puppy into his arms. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice soothing despite the icy water. "I've got you now." As he made his way back to the shore, Mark's relief was short-lived. A low, guttural growl stopped him in his tracks. Standing on the riverbank, her massive frame silhouetted against the fading light, was the puppy's mother. A full-grown pit bull, her stance was rigid, her teeth bared in a snarl that sent a chill down Mark's spine. Mark froze, the icy water lapping against his legs as he locked eyes with the mother pit bull. She stood rigid at the edge of the riverbank, her sharp growl growing louder, echoing off the trees around them. Her eyes burned with a fierce intensity, locked on the tiny, shivering puppy in Mark's arms. His heart pounded, and for a moment, he wasn't sure what to do. The mother's posture was unmistakably defensive, her tail held low, muscles taut, ready to spring. He could feel the weight of her distrust, every inch of her body screaming that she thought he was a threat. "Easy," Mark murmured, his voice low and steady, though fear prickled at the edges of his resolve. "I'm not here to hurt you, or your pup." The puppy whimpered softly in his arms, its tiny body trembling. Mark tightened his hold, trying to shield it from the cold and the mother's intimidating presence, but his protective gesture seemed to only enrage her further. She took a step forward, baring her teeth, and a low snarl ripped through the air. Mark's mind raced. He knew enough about dogs to understand that making sudden movements could escalate the situation. He needed to stay calm, even if every instinct told him to back away. Slowly he crouched, lowering himself and the puppy closer to the ground, trying to appear less threatening. The mother paused, her growl faltering slightly as she watched him. Mark saw a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a renewed intensity as she lunged forward, stopping just shy of the water's edge. Her paws splashed into the shallows, her growl deepening. "I'm trying to help," Mark said firmly, though his hands trembled. "Your pup was trapped. I couldn't just leave it there." His words meant nothing to her, but his tone seemed to reach her on some level. She tilted her head slightly, her growl tapering off just enough for Mark to see the faintest crack in her ferocity. Still, her posture remained defensive, and he knew one wrong move could tip the balance. Mark slowly rose to his feet, the puppy still cradled against his chest. The mother stiffened, her growl returning as she took another step forward. The gap between them felt impossibly small, the tension almost unbearable. Then something unexpected happened. The puppy squirmed in Mark's arms, letting out a sharp yip. The sound seemed to snap the mother out of her aggression. Her growl stopped abruptly, and her ears perked forward. For the first time, Mark saw something other than fury in her eyes. Concern. The mother let out a low whine, her stance softening slightly. She took a hesitant step closer, her eyes darting between Mark and the puppy. Mark saw his opportunity. Carefully, he knelt again, placing the puppy on the ground a few feet away. "There you go," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your pup is safe now." The puppy stumbled toward its mother, its tiny legs wobbling with exhaustion. The mother stepped forward, her focus entirely on her pup now. She sniffed it thoroughly, her body still tense, but no longer aggressive. When she seemed satisfied that it was unharmed, she turned her gaze back to Mark. Mark braced himself, expecting her growl to return. But instead, she stood there, watching him with an expression that was no longer purely hostile. There was still caution in her eyes, but it was tempered by something else, perhaps a trace of gratitude. "You're welcome," Mark said with a nervous chuckle, though his heart was still racing. He took a careful step back, giving her space. The mother pitbull didn't move, her eyes following him, but her body language remaining neutral. Mark climbed back onto the riverbank, his clothes soaked and his limbs heavy from the cold. He watched as the mother curled protectively around her pup, licking it gently as it nestled against her. For the first time, Mark noticed how thin she was, her ribs visible beneath her coat. She looked tired, worn, and yet fiercely determined to protect her young. As he turned to leave, Mark felt a pang of guilt. They were both survivors, fighting against a world that had clearly been unkind to them. He couldn't just walk away, not when he could do something to help. He hesitated, then crouched a safe distance away. "I'll be back," he said softly, "with food. You deserve that much." The mother pitbull didn't respond, but as Mark walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that she understood more than she let on. And as he climbed the trail back to his car, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of story lay behind her fierce eyes, and if he had a part to play in it. Mark couldn't stop thinking about the mother pitbull and her pup. As he sat in his kitchen later that night, the image of the emaciated dog, her ribs visible, and her eyes a mixture of fear and exhaustion, lingered in his mind. He had seen stray dogs before, but something about her haunted him. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival. She was fighting for her pup's life, too. The next morning, armed with a bag of kibble and a few cans of wet dog food, Mark returned to the trail. He wasn't entirely sure why he felt so compelled to help her, but he couldn't ignore the pull. Something about the fierce determination in her eyes reminded him of himself. Not long ago, he too had been fighting his own battles, barely making it through the day. Maybe that was why he felt this connection to her. When Mark reached the riverbank, the mother pitbull was exactly where he had left her, curled protectively around her pup. She looked up as soon as she heard him approach, her body tensing immediately. Mark stopped a safe distance away, holding his hands up. "It's just me," he said softly. "I brought food." Her growl started low, a warning that she wasn't ready to trust him yet. Mark stayed still, his movements deliberate as he placed the bag of food on the ground and stepped back. He crouched a few feet away, watching as the mother sniffed the air cautiously. "It's okay," he murmured. "It's for you." Her eyes darted between Mark and the bag, her body poised to flee or attack if necessary. Slowly, she stepped forward, her nose twitching as she sniffed the bag. Mark held his breath as she tore into it, pulling out one of the cans of wet food. She paused, looking at him as if expecting him to take it away. Mark stayed where he was, his heart pounding. "Go ahead," he said, his voice steady. "It's yours." The mother opened the can with her teeth, her movements quick and efficient. She ate in hungry gulps, her body relaxing slightly as she realized the food wasn't a trap. Her pup toddled over, nudging at her side, and she paused long enough to let it eat too. Mark watched in silence, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions. He had expected her to be cautious, but seeing her let her guard down even slightly was more than he had hoped for. He felt an odd sense of pride, as though this small gesture of trust was a victory. When the food was gone, the mother turned her gaze back to him. Her eyes were sharp, but the hostility was fading, replaced by something more curious. She took a hesitant step toward him, sniffing the air as if trying to figure him out. Mark stayed still, his heart racing as she came closer. She stopped a few feet away, her body tense but no longer aggressive. For a moment, they just looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. "You're a fighter," Mark said softly, his voice breaking the quiet. "I can see that." The mother pit bull blinked, her head tilting slightly, as if she was listening. Then, to Mark's surprise, she sat down, her posture cautious but calm. It wasn't much, but it felt like a breakthrough. Over the next few days, Mark continued to visit, bringing food and water each time. The mother's wariness slowly gave way to curiosity, and by the end of the week, she allowed him to sit closer. Her pup, bolder than she was, even toddled over to sniff his hand. "You're a brave little guy," Mark said, smiling as the pup licked his fingers. The mother watched closely, but she didn't intervene. It was as if she was beginning to understand that he wasn't a threat. By the end of the week, the mother pit bull did something that stunned Mark. As he sat on the ground with the pup in his lap, she walked over and nudged his arm with her nose. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Mark felt a lump rise in his throat as he reached out, letting his hand rest gently on her head. "You're a good mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've been through so much, haven't you?" She closed her eyes briefly, leaning into his touch. It was the first time she had shown any sign of affection, and it nearly brought Mark to tears. For the first time, he saw her not as a feral animal, but as a mother who had done everything she could to protect her child. As the sun began to set, Mark reluctantly stood to leave. The mother pit bull followed him to the edge of the riverbank, her pup trotting close behind. She didn't growl or bare her teeth. She simply watched as he walked away. "I'll see you tomorrow," he called over his shoulder. And for the first time, he felt like she believed him. Mark returned the next day as promised, with another bag of food, fresh water, and a soft blanket he hoped the mother pit bull might use for her pup. The connection they had begun to build felt fragile, as though one wrong move could shatter the fragile trust between them. But Mark was determined. She deserved more than the life she was enduring. When he arrived at the riverbank, something was wrong. The mother pit bull was pacing nervously, her ears pinned back and her eyes darting around. Her pup was curled in a ball, trembling beneath her. The sight sent a wave of concern crashing through Mark. "Hey," he called softly, stopping a few feet away. "What's going on?" The mother froze, her eyes locking onto his. Her growl was low but uncertain, more a warning than a threat. She was scared, and whatever had spooked her was still nearby. Mark scanned the area, his eyes catching movement in the distance. Two figures were walking along the trail, a pair of teenage boys with sticks in their hands. "Idiots," Mark muttered under his breath. He knew exactly what they were doing. They had probably seen the pit bull and thought it would be fun to harass her. His chest tightened with anger. Didn't they see how thin she was? How much she had already been through? Mark turned back to her. "It's okay," he said gently. "I'm here. I won't let anything happen to you." But she wasn't reassured. Her body remained tense, her eyes darting between Mark and the approaching boys. She stepped protectively in front of her pup, her growl intensifying. The boys were getting closer now, their laughter carrying through the trees. "Look at that ugly mutt," one of them jeered, raising his stick. "Bet she's mean as hell." Mark stood, his voice firm. "Hey, that's enough." The boys froze, startled by his sudden presence. "What's it to you, old man?" the taller one sneered. "It's everything to me," Mark shot back, stepping between the boys and the pit bull. "She's not bothering anyone. Leave her alone." The boys hesitated, their bravado faltering under Mark's glare. Finally, they muttered something under their breath and turned back the way they came, disappearing down the trail. Mark exhaled, turning back to the mother pit bull. She was still tense, her growl now directed at the spot where the boys had stood. Slowly, Mark crouched down, holding out his hands. "They're gone," he said softly. "It's just us now." She didn't move at first, her eyes narrowing as she watched him. But then, as if realizing he had been protecting her, she let out a deep breath. Her growl faded, and she lowered herself to the ground beside her pup. Mark approached cautiously, setting the bag of food and the blanket a few feet away. "You're safe," he murmured, his voice steady. "I won't let anything happen to you." The mother looked at him, her eyes softer now. She sniffed the blanket hesitantly before pulling it closer to her pup. Mark watched as she nosed the fabric around her baby, creating a makeshift bed. For the next hour, Mark sat nearby, letting the mother and pup eat in peace. He didn't try to touch her. He knew better than to push his luck, but the tension between them had eased. When she finished eating, she surprised him again. This time she approached him on her own, her movements slow and deliberate. Mark held his breath as she sniffed his outstretched hand. Then, to his astonishment, she licked his fingers. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. "You're something special," Mark said softly, his throat tight with emotion. "You've been through so much, haven't you?" The mother sat down beside him, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, Mark felt like she truly saw him, not as a threat, but as someone she could trust. As the sun began to set, Mark knew it was time to leave. He stood slowly, not wanting to startle her. "I'll be back tomorrow," he promised, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out together." The mother watched him go, her pup tucked safely against her side, and as Mark walked back up the trail, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a threshold. She had let him in, just a little, but it was enough to change everything. The next morning, Mark arrived earlier than usual, a sense of urgency tugging at him. The encounter with the boys from the day before had unsettled him. He couldn't stop thinking about how vulnerable the mother pit bull and her pup were, exposed to the dangers of the wild and the cruelty of others. He was determined to do more for them, even if it meant stepping out of his comfort zone. As he approached the riverbank, his heart sank. The mother pit bull was pacing anxiously, her movements erratic and frantic. Her pup wasn't in sight. Mark quickened his pace, his pulse racing as he scanned the area. "Where's your pup?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. The mother turned to him, her eyes wide and panicked. She let out a series of sharp barks, running a few feet before stopping to look back at him. It was clear she was trying to tell him something. Mark's stomach churned. "Show me," he said, his tone urgent. The mother took off, her lean body weaving through the trees with surprising speed. Mark followed, his boots crunching against the underbrush as he struggled to keep up. She led him away from the river, deeper into the woods, her movements frantic but purposeful. They emerged into a small clearing, and Mark's heart stopped. The pup was there, tangled in a mess of thorny vines. It was whimpering softly, its tiny body struggling against the sharp thorns that snagged its fur and skin. Mark dropped to his knees beside the pup, his hands moving quickly to untangle it. The mother hovered close, her growls low and constant, her eyes locked on every move Mark made. "It's okay," Mark said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through him. "I'll get him out." The thorns were stubborn, and the pup let out a sharp cry as Mark worked to free it. The mother stepped closer, her growls growing louder, and Mark froze. "I'm helping," he said firmly, meeting her intense gaze. "Trust me." For a moment, he wasn't sure if she would. But then, as if understanding his words, she backed off slightly, giving him space to work. Mark redoubled his efforts, his fingers bleeding as he carefully untangled the pup. Finally, with one last pull, the little dog was free. He cradled the pup in his arms, inspecting it for injuries. It was scratched and trembling, but otherwise unharmed. "You're okay," he murmured, his voice soft. "You're safe now." The mother stepped forward, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and gratitude. She sniffed the pup, licking its face as if to reassure herself that it was truly unharmed. Mark watched as the tension drained from her body, replaced by something he hadn't seen before: trust. Back at the riverbank, Mark set up the blanket and food as usual. The pup nestled close to its mother, still shaken, but visibly calmer. Mark sat a few feet away, his body aching from the effort, but his heart lighter than it had been in days. The mother pitbull approached him, her movements slow and deliberate. She stopped in front of him, her eyes locking onto his. Then, to his astonishment, she did something he would never forget. She pressed her nose gently against his hand and let out a soft whine. Mark felt his throat tighten. It was as if she was saying thank you, in the only way she knew how. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her head. She didn't pull away. "You're incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've been through so much, and you're still fighting. You deserve better than this." The mother leaned into his touch, her body relaxing completely for the first time. Mark felt a wave of emotion wash over him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about giving her and her pup a chance at a better life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark made a decision. He couldn't leave them out here any longer, vulnerable to the elements and the cruelty of the world. They needed safety, stability, and a home, and he was determined to give it to them. "I'm going to take care of you," he said softly, looking between the mother and her pup. "Both of you." The mother pit bull tilted her head, as if considering his words. She didn't growl or pull away. Instead, she sat beside him, her body close enough to touch. It was a moment of profound understanding, and Mark knew there was no turning back. He had found them in a moment of desperation, but now they had found each other in a way that neither of them could have anticipated. The decision to bring the pit bull and her pup home wasn't one Mark made lightly. His house wasn't much, just a modest single-story home with a small yard, but it was warm, safe, and full of potential for a fresh start. As he loaded the mother and her pup into the back of his old pickup truck, he couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt. Would they adjust? Would she trust him enough to settle in? The mother pit bull sat protectively beside her pup, her eyes watching Mark intently as he secured the truck bed. "It's going to be okay," he said softly, his voice carrying more reassurance than he felt. "We'll figure this out together." The drive back was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound, as Mark glanced at them through the rearview mirror. The pup had curled up in the blanket, its tiny body rising and falling with each breath. The mother, however, stayed alert, her gaze fixed on him, as if trying to decipher his intentions. When they arrived, Mark opened the gate to his yard and set out the blanket in a shaded corner near the porch. He filled a bowl with water and another with food, placing them nearby. The mother pit bull stepped out of the truck cautiously, her movements deliberate as she surveyed the unfamiliar surroundings. "This is your home now," Mark said, crouching to her level. "It's not much, but it's safe." She sniffed the air, her ears swiveling as she took in the new environment. The pup stumbled out of the truck after her, its tiny tail wagging as it explored the grass. Mark smiled, a sense of relief washing over him as he watched them. The mother approached the food bowl, sniffing it before taking a cautious bite. Her pup followed suit, its small tongue lapping at the water. Mark stayed a respectful distance away, not wanting to overwhelm them, but he couldn't deny the warmth spreading through his chest as he watched them settle in. Over the next few days, a routine began to take shape. The mother pitbull, whom Mark had started calling Luna, grew more comfortable with each passing moment. She still kept a watchful eye on him, but her body language softened. The pup, now named Rocky, was a bundle of energy, tumbling through the yard and bringing a smile to Mark's face more times than he could count. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark sat on the porch, watching Luna and Rocky play in the yard. Luna's movements were no longer guarded. She ran with her pup, her tail wagging as they chased each other through the grass. It was the first time Mark had seen her truly let go, and it was a sight that brought tears to his eyes. "You're amazing. You know that?" he said quietly, his voice carrying across the yard. Luna stopped, her head tilting as she looked at him. She padded over, her steps confident but calm, and sat down beside him. Mark reached out, his hand brushing against her head. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly as if savoring the moment. It was a gesture of trust that left him speechless. That night, Mark sat in his living room, Rocky curled up in his lap and Luna lying at his feet. The house felt fuller than it had in years, the quiet no longer oppressive but comforting. For the first time, he realized how much he had needed them as much as they had needed him. Luna lifted her head, her eyes meeting his. In them, he saw not just a dog but a survivor, a mother who had done everything to protect her pup and who had now found a safe place to call home. "You're part of the family now," Mark said softly, "and I promise I'll never let anything happen to you." Luna let out a soft sigh, her head resting on his leg. It was as if she understood every word, her body relaxing completely for the first time. Mark felt a lump rise in his throat, overwhelmed by the bond they had formed in such a short time. As the moon rose high in the sky, Mark sat in the quiet warmth of his home, surrounded by the 2 lives he had saved. It wasn't just their journey that had changed. It was his. They had given him something he hadn't realized he was missing: purpose, connection, and a reason to keep moving forward. And as he stroked Luna's fur, he knew one thing for certain: they had saved each other. The weeks turned into months, and life with Luna and Rocky became a rhythm that filled Mark's days with joy and purpose. The house, once eerily quiet and steeped in solitude, was now alive with the pitter-patter of Rocky's tiny paws and the reassuring presence of Luna, who had settled into her role as both protector and companion. Mark couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come, from the frightened, growling dog by the riverbank to the trusting, loyal friend who now lay peacefully at his feet. But their journey wasn't without its challenges. Trust, Mark realized, wasn't something that could be built overnight. Luna still had moments where her past crept into the present. Loud noises, fireworks, the rumble of a passing truck sent her into a defensive stance, her body stiff and her eyes scanning for threats. On those nights, Mark would sit beside her, his hand resting gently on her head until she calmed down. "You're safe now," he would whisper, and though it took time, she began to believe him. One day, Mark decided to take Luna and Rocky on a new adventure, a trip to the lake just outside of town. He had heard about a dog-friendly area where they could run and play freely, something he thought Luna would enjoy after months of building her confidence. The ride to the lake was uneventful, but as soon as they arrived, Rocky began to bounce with excitement, his tail wagging furiously. Luna, on the other hand, was more cautious, her nose twitching as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Mark let them explore at their own pace, keeping a watchful eye as they ventured closer to the water. Rocky was the first to dive in, splashing and paddling with uncoordinated enthusiasm. Luna stood at the edge, her paws just touching the water, watching her pup with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. Mark knelt beside her. "It's okay, girl," he said, his voice soft. "You don't have to be afraid." After a moment, Luna stepped forward, the water lapping at her legs. Slowly she waded in, her movements cautious but deliberate. Rocky paddled over to her, his little nose bumping against her side as if encouraging her to join him. For the first time, Mark saw a spark of playfulness in her eyes as she splashed back at her pup. Mark laughed, the sound carrying across the lake. It was a moment of pure joy, one that reminded him of why he had taken that first step to save them. They had given him a reason to live fully again, and in turn, he had given them a safe place to heal. Later that evening, back at home, Mark sat on the porch with a warm cup of tea. Luna lay at his feet, her head resting on his lap, while Rocky snoozed in a patch of moonlight. The peaceful scene was interrupted by the distant sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Mark frowned. He wasn't expecting visitors. The knock at the door came moments later, hesitant but firm. Mark opened it to find a woman standing on the porch, holding a flyer. She looked to be in her 30s, her face lined with worry. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for my dog. She's a pit bull, brown with white markings. Have you seen her?" Mark's heart dropped. He glanced back at Luna, who was now standing in the doorway, her body tense. The woman's eyes widened. "Luna?" she whispered. Mark stepped aside as the woman crouched, tears streaming down her face. "It's really you," she said, her voice trembling. Luna took a hesitant step forward, sniffing the woman's outstretched hand. Then, to Mark's surprise, she leaned into her, her tail wagging softly. "She was yours?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded, her hand stroking Luna's fur. "Her name's Bella. She went missing months ago when someone broke into my yard. I searched everywhere. I thought I'd lost her forever." Over the next hour, the woman, whose name was Emily, told Mark about Bella's life before she had ended up by the river. She had been a rescue herself, adopted from a shelter after being abandoned as a puppy. Emily had loved her fiercely, but their time together had been cut short by that fateful day. Mark listened, his emotions a whirlwind. He looked at Luna, Bella, lying contentedly at Emily's feet, and his heart ached at the thought of saying goodbye, but he also knew how much Emily had missed her. "I just want what's best for her," Mark said finally. "She's been through so much. I want her to be happy." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've given her so much already, but I can see how much she means to you. Maybe we can figure something out." In the weeks that followed, Mark and Emily worked together to ensure Bella's transition back to her old life was smooth. Emily visited often, bringing treats and toys, and Mark could see the bond between them rekindling. But something incredible happened. Bella didn't forget Mark. Every time Emily came to take her home for a visit, Bella hesitated, looking back at Mark as if asking for reassurance. One day, Emily arrived with a decision. "Mark," she said, her voice steady, "Bella has 2 homes now. She loves you, and I can see how much you love her. Let's share her." Mark was stunned. "Are you sure?" Emily smiled, tears in her eyes. "She deserves all the love in the world, and I think we can give her that, together." As time passed, Bella thrived in her 2 homes, splitting her time between Emily and Mark. Rocky remained Mark's full-time companion, and the bond between him and Bella was unbreakable. Together, they formed an unconventional but beautiful family, one built on trust, love, and second chances. And as Mark sat on his porch one evening, watching Bella and Rocky play in the yard, he realized that life had given him something he hadn't even known he was searching for: a purpose, a community, and a reason to believe in the goodness of the world. They had all saved each other, in ways none of them could have imagined. Mark never imagined that a simple walk along the river would change his life so profoundly. What began as a moment of compassion, rescuing a helpless pit bull puppy trapped in the water, had transformed into a journey of healing, trust, and love. It wasn't just Bella, the mother pitbull, who found a second chance, Mark himself had rediscovered a sense of purpose that he thought was long gone. As he reflected on the months that had passed, Mark marveled at the twists and turns their journey had taken. Bella's transformation from a frightened, growling protector to a loving, loyal companion was nothing short of miraculous. She had taught Mark the true meaning of resilience, how to persevere through pain and fear and emerge stronger on the other side. Her unwavering determination to protect her pup mirrored Mark's own desire to protect and care for her. In a way, they were two souls who had found exactly what they needed in each other. Rocky, too, had been a source of endless joy. His playful antics and boundless energy filled the once silent home with laughter and warmth. Watching him grow, Mark couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. Rocky had inherited Bella's courage and gentle nature, and he was thriving in the safety and love of his new family. And then there was Emily, Bella's original owner. Mark had feared that her return would mean saying goodbye to Bella, but instead, it had added another layer of beauty to their story. Emily's willingness to share Bella, to let her be part of both their lives, spoke volumes about her character and her love for her dog. Together, they had created an unconventional family, united by their shared desire to give Bella and Rocky the life they deserved. Mark had learned so much from this experience. He had learned that trust isn't built overnight, but through consistent acts of kindness and patience. He had learned that love comes in many forms, and sometimes it finds you when you least expect it. Most importantly, he had learned that second chances aren't just for the ones you save, they're for you too. This story of Bella, Rocky, and Mark reminds us of the profound impact love and compassion can have, not just on the lives we touch, but on our own. It's a testament to the transformative power of second chances and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. If you've ever been moved by the courage of a rescue animal or inspired by the love of a pet, take a moment to reflect on how these connections shape our lives. They teach us patience, resilience, and the importance of kindness in a world that often feels overwhelming. What can we learn from their loyalty, their strength, and their ability to forgive? Now we'd love to hear from you. Have you experienced something similar? Has an animal changed your life in ways you couldn't have imagined? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience could inspire someone else to open their heart and home to an animal in need. If Bella and Rocky's story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you'll be joining a community that celebrates the beauty of compassion and the power of connection. Like this video and share it with others who believe in second chances. Your support helps us continue to bring inspiring stories to light. Stories that remind us all of the goodness in the world. And don't stop there. Consider supporting your local animal shelter or rescue organization. Every small act of kindness, donating supplies, volunteering your time, or adopting an animal in need can create a ripple effect of hope and healing. Together we can make a difference for animals like Bella and Rocky, giving them the futures they deserve. Let this story inspire you to take action, to embrace second chances, and to celebrate the love and courage that animals bring into our lives. Together we can create a world where every animal knows the safety of a loving home, the joy of a full belly, and the warmth of a kind touch.